Yeah, thank you so much. I saw in the chat says go Big Ten. Uh, Still a Big Ten fan. Happy to be in the Patriot League now, but I grew up in Buckeye country, so I grew up always watching the Big Ten schools. But yeah, I think it was around December when Corey reached out to me about this opportunity, and it was funny because I saw the title, the topic of this semester's theme, and it was healing. How are you making it through? And um, it reminded me of an article I was reading, maybe a day or two before, and the Washington Post every single year they actually have a group of historians that meet and they end up discussing the events of the year, and then they try to come up with one word that encapsulates that entire year. And so 2020 being what it was, being different on many fronts, not just in terms of the pandemic, but also in terms of social justice and just things of all different categories. Historians honestly couldn't come up with a word, just a single word for the year. So they actually ended up submitting a survey, and they're saying, what are words that come to mind to help you encapsulate this entire year? And the number one response was heartbreaking. And so I think that this theme is very relevant. I think that every single person's COVID story is unique, but we've all experienced loss, and it was hard on all fronts. So I'm excited today to give my story of COVID-19. And I, I was talking to Corey a week ago, and I was asking him about the speakers that have already presented and the speakers that are, going to present. And I think that there were psychiatrists or something like that. So what I'm saying today is definitely not professional advice, but it's my personal anecdote of how I personally experience healing. So with that being said, the outline is that I'm going to give my full COVID-19 story, and then after thinking back about everything I went through, I think that there were three big themes with how I experienced healing with it. So I was going to share those, and then at the end, I kind of hope that it becomes a conversation. And so feel free to be vulnerable and share if anything resonates with you, and also feel free to ask questions. But with that being said, so tomorrow actually marks the 1 year anniversary since that we were sent home. And so um, looking back about a year ago this week, I went home, and I had no idea that I had COVID-19. Um, when we were getting sent home, there were no active cases that we knew of on campus. And so we went home, and no one thought to quarantine, no one thought to wear a mask. And so I went home and um, didn't take any of the precautions because those weren't a thing yet. And so um, now that I look back, maybe I had a couple symptoms. I lost my sense of taste and smell, but those weren't COVID-19 symptoms yet that we knew of. This was right in the beginning of the pandemic. So honestly, I kind of thought maybe it was just seasonal allergies. And eventually, about a week or two after being home, I noticed that my brother started getting sick, and he was having the actual COVID-19 symptoms. And at this point, we were getting emails that there were several students who did in fact go home after being at Colgate, and they tested positive. So we knew at that point, okay, COVID-19 was on campus. I was probably exposed. My brother's starting to get sick, and then one by one, the rest of my family started getting sick. Then my mom got sick, and then my dad got sick. Um, my brother, he was the typical, definitely felt ill, but could stay in bed, and that was fine. Um, we were actually worried about my mom. My mom had really bad asthma. And so we kind of thought, okay, if she gets COVID, she would struggle with it. And so we were definitely keeping an eye on her. My dad was starting to get sick, more and more sick day by day. But I remember after a few days of when they started having symptoms, I remember specifically it was on a Monday, it was March 30th. Um, my mom called in from work. She just told people, I'm really sick today. I'm sorry, like I can't make it. She stayed in bed all day. She was sleeping. Um, we were checking in on her periodically. I remember in the morning, this was our first day back after a 2-week spring break. Um, I remember in the morning, I went to her and I said, hey, like, do you need me to take you to a doctor? Like, what's going on? Just let me know. At this point, testing was very scarce. I think you had to have a fever of, I kind of forget the threshold. There was a threshold where they wouldn't test you for COVID unless you had a certain temperature, and my mom was just under that temperature, so they wouldn't test her. And basically, if you weren't going to get tested, then they were saying, don't come to the hospital, like just stay at home, just quarantine at home. And so we're just keeping an eye on her. I ended up going throughout my day, and eventually I go check back in on my mom. It's around the evening now, just finished my first day back at school. And I ended up, my mom was asleep, but I ended up finding her. She was breathing very shallowly. I don't know if that's a word, but it was very shallow. And she couldn't get a full breath. She was very pale. You couldn't really wake her up. And so we ended up um, having her rushed to the hospital, and they ended up admitting her right away. They put her on an observation floor, and she was just basically on oxygen and basically just asleep and just trying to get her O2 saturation up. But remained pretty stable overall. And so we were pretty shaken up. I remember my dad and I dropped her off at the hospital. We came back home, and we were just kind of sad and just shaken up. And then again, my brother was just at home basically. And the next day, so this was Tuesday, March 31st, my dad comes to me in the morning and he said, Grace, like I can't really breathe. Like I can't get a full breath. I'm really struggling. Um, and he was a guy where we thought, okay, if he had COVID, pretty healthy guy, no underlying conditions, so it's fine, he'll make it through. But he was really struggling to breathe, and he was also shaking like very violently, like he was shivering really bad. We took his temperature that morning. It was 105 degrees. Like it was a complete 180. Like he was showing symptoms, but all of a sudden it just took a drastic turn for the worse. And so because his symptoms were so severe, I didn't want a repeat of what was happening with my mom. So we rushed him to the hospital, and again, they admit him right away, and they actually put him on the observation unit floor in a room that was directly across from my mom. So both my parents at that point were hospitalized, and I was just taking care of my brother at home. And so I remember the next day, it was Wednesday, it was April 1st. I woke up, I texted my parents. I said, hey, like no, April Fool's Day pranks today, And so, because I was really worried about them being in the hospital. I ended up getting that was the day where I ended up getting a call from a doctor, and I forget his name, but he introduced himself as an oncologist, and I knew like, okay, like that's weird, you're an oncologist, that's cancer, like why are you talking to me? And so he introduced himself and he said, hey, like I just want to let you know that we just ran through your dad's lab work and his blood work, and he actually has a rare form of leukemia, and there's good and bad news. The good news is that it's an extremely slow growing cancer. But the bad news is that we don't have a cure. And so I just, he was like, I know this is scary, but just focus on, getting him through COVID-19 right now. We'll discuss more later. And so I remember that definitely shook me up there, because you're never okay with hearing that your parent has cancer. And especially when no cancer is good, but especially when it's one that's not curable, it really hits hard. And so I remember that was a rough day to really get through. And kind of going through the timeline. So that was Wednesday. Wednesday became Thursday, and then Thursday became Friday. I woke up at 5:30 in the morning on Friday to a phone call from a doctor, and I pick it up, and the doctor goes, "Hey, I just want to let you know that last night when the nurses went into your dad's room and they found him collapsed on the floor, they think he was going into cardiac arrest. Once we were able to stabilize him, we brought him to the ICU. He's in critical condition right now." And it was just like this endless cycle of bad news that kept, mounting and mounting. And I just remember being scared at that point. It's hard to get that news, but it's hard to get that news when you don't have a parent with you. And you're trying to basically just take care of your brother who's at home, who's sick. But I remember, I just remember that day. That was a day that will stick with me forever because I was very scared at that point. And I remember later on throughout the day, it's around lunchtime, my phone goes off and I look down and I see caller ID and it says dad. And so I thought, okay, like that has to be a positive thing because, my dad's talking to me, like, so he's able to talk, so I answer, I go, hey, and all I hear is this loud oxygen machine. And I hear this really faint voice, like he's really fighting to basically speak, and it's in this really low voice. He can't really catch his breath. And he goes, "Hey, Grace, I just want to let you know that they're going to put me on a ventilator." And I just remember, like, at that point, like that moment took me down, completely caught off guard. And it's like it kept getting worse and I didn't know what was going to come next. And so, I was trying to speak, but I couldn't. I just remember I was just like crying at that point. And he goes, Grace, like, I won't be able to talk to you for a few days because of it. And he's like, and I just want to let you know, like, this could be it. And in that moment, I basically had like 10 seconds to say goodbye, to kind of prepare a goodbye just in case I wasn't going to be able to see him anymore, if he wasn't going to make it. And so remember the only words I could get out were basically like, "I love you, Dad." Like that was it. And then that was definitely the worst moment I remember. And after that, my dad hung up. I remember just kind of frantically, like always looking at my phone, like felt like every second to see if a doctor was going to call, give me news to update me. And I remember a little while later, I ended up getting a call from the ICU doctor, and he said that, hey, like, your dad is on a ventilator now. We just need to let you know that he did sign advance directives ahead of time. He only wants to be on the ventilator for 72 hours. And so after that, like, we have to take him off no matter how he's doing. And also he did sign a DNR. So there's not much really that we can do at this point except hope that he pulls through and then try other experimental drugs. Again, this was the beginning of COVID-19, so like there was no set protocol, there were no set treatments in line, and everything was experimental. There were really no hard results that you could really cling to. And so at that moment, I just remember, like, in the back of my head, I had like this 72-hour countdown. I was just scared, like every single second. I'm like, it's getting closer and closer to where like my dad could just be off a ventilator and that's it. And so I remember, 24 hours into it, the next day, I get a call from the doctor and he said, "Hey, like, I just want to let you know, like, it could go either way at this point. Like, his stats are still dropping. We have one more shot at this, basically. We can try this experimental drug. It's a steroid. Here's the catch. It has a mortality rate of 25%. It's been inducing cardiac arrests in 1 in 4 patients." So he said, so it's a risk, but at this point, it's about our only option because our only other option is hope that he can pull through in 2 days. And so at that point, I was so scared, but I said, okay, it's our only option, so let's do it. And so he ended up getting put on a steroid, and and it was just a matter of time. We were just waiting basically. And I remember for the next 2 days, doctors would call about, seemed like whenever they would change shifts, like every 12 hours. Um and they would say like, okay, like, his stats aren't declining anymore. They're just where they're at basically, where they've been at. So we're hoping that he's going to make a turn soon. um and I remember it was going into the third day that night, going into the third day that he was on a ventilator. There was this drastic improvement, just out of nowhere, like a complete turn, complete 180, where his stats improved enough where he could come off the ventilator, still in critical condition, but he was able to be on some sort of, it was like high flow oxygen. And so he was able to be de-escalated on a lower oxygen machine, if that makes sense. And so there was a huge turn, and it was amazing because because we didn't have, even though he wasn't out of the woods, like we weren't on that 72-hour clock anymore. And so eventually, once he got off the ventilator, he did end up staying off the ventilator. It was touch and go for a couple weeks in the ICU, but he was eventually able to stay stable and to keep having improved results. And my mom, on the other hand, like, her worst night in the hospital was the night she was admitted. Like after a few days of just being on oxygen, she was able to come home after a week or so. And so eventually my parents were able to come home, were able to recover through all of that. Um, but there was definitely a huge, going through something like that definitely traumatizes you. And that was just the beginning of COVID. We had a whole slew of other things that happened throughout the year that kind of just added onto what we went through. And so um, this is kind of where I talk about where my healing came in. So I would say, without a doubt, the day that my dad went on a ventilator was probably that was a day that kind of broke me in a sense. I won't get into exact details, but I'll just kind of say that before leading up to COVID-19, like I was already going through some rough things in my life. As Corey mentioned, I ended up transferring from Ohio State University. And so my reason, to kind of keep it light, is that my reason for transferring from Ohio State was that, without giving too much detail, the soccer program there was very abusive, not just me, but to all of its athletes. Um, and there was just a lot, a 2-year window of just like constant abuse, constant being put down, verbally and emotionally and physically. And so I came to Colgate looking for a fresh start, but also like uh, not not at my best. Like I was definitely going through a lot at that point too, but excited to be at Colgate. And so when my dad's health declined, when my dad was diagnosed with cancer, when my dad went on a ventilator, that was kind of like the tipping point of all this trauma that was like happening in my life, where I kind of just broke and I hit this spell of where honestly, like I felt numb. Like I I just felt broken, and I felt like I was super pessimistic. Um, I just wasn't me mentally or emotionally. I was kind of just checked out. And um and I remember, um as even though my dad came home, we were all excited about that obviously, but now like in dealing with his cancer and then like other things that were coming up, like um just things being shut down in general. Also our season for soccer at the time being canceled. Just all these things that, also I had a really important research opportunity that was canceled too. And so I just remember all these events basically leading up, and then things just getting worse and worse. I felt like everything that I had in my life that could be good was basically just getting taken away from me. And so I was in a really dark place. And and I remember I experienced healing in three ways through all of this. And so the first thing I want to talk about is that um, sometimes we ask for help and we expect the circumstance to change, but instead we are given people to help us through the circumstance that will change us. I remember a lot of times, I know that there are probably all different faiths in in this meeting right now, but personally, I'm a Christian, and so I remember I would pray. I'm like, man, like, quit taking stuff from me, kind of like. I wanted things to stop. I wanted things to be normal. And so I would get upset that I had to go through certain things, that things were still being taken away from me in a sense. And so um, I've come to realize that, you know, bad things, even though they're not fun to go through, they do make us grow. They do change us. And so in a sense, they're necessary in a way. And even though I was asking for the situation to change, in my opinion, God was going to have me go through that situation, but at the same time, He was giving me people to help me through that situation. I'm so grateful for the support system that I had going through everything. I never realized how big my support system was and how many people were in my corner until I went through that. Um, everyone from teammates to coaches, faculty, professors, and CCA, and I had so many people in my corner, and not even just at school, but even at home, where people really were pulling me through the situation because I really wanted to shut down. I was so upset and so depressed. I wasn't taking care of myself. I wasn't sleeping. I wasn't eating. And I just remember people wouldn't let me give up, and people wouldn't let me give up on myself at all. And so I got through that situation because people were pulling me through that situation. And so I'm very grateful for that. Um, and, I'll admit last semester, it was rough because I felt like, after my dad came home, I'm like, okay, phew, like we dodged a bullet, we can move on. We can try to normalize. Like I just got through something really tough, but like, let's just get back to normal. And so, as things were still getting taken away, experiences were still getting taken away, opportunities were being lost because of COVID-19, because of shutdowns. I remember just the sense of, okay, let's just move on. Let's just keep trying to normalize. Let's just keep trying to normalize. And eventually untreated anxiety turns into depression. And so I remember I got to this point where I was just so depressed last semester. And I texted my coach, I remember, and I said, hey, like, I gotta talk to you. Like, I'm not okay. Like, I'm kind of going through something right now, and I kind of just need to let someone in. And so I remember I met with my coach, and we both had this really long discussion. We were both crying. And I just told her, I said, like, I'm not myself. Like, I'm at my lowest point right now. I'm so anxious. I'm overthinking things. Like, I don't know what's wrong with me. I don't know what's wrong with my thinking. Like, I was having panic attacks at this point. I remember, like, every single day I would have a panic attack, and I couldn't, I was at a low. I was not functioning. And so, my coach really helped me. She's like, you know what I want you to do, Grace? She's like, thank you for letting me in. I want you to let in a couple more friends. She's like, not everyone, but I want you to let in a couple people who are close in your life, where they can monitor you. They can, they can help you, pull you through this. And I also started seeing a counselor at that point. And it really helped. Letting people in really helps. You're not using them as a crutch, but you're using them as a tool. You're working on yourself, but letting people in lets you get through really dark places in your life. And so a second thing, I would say point number 2 that helped in my healing was that simply without hope, you have nothing. But even more importantly, make sure your hope won't fail you. Um, I think this is a really important point because I remember, um, last semester I felt like I was putting my hope in the wrong thing. I was almost relying on people too much to help me through, um, you know, help me through my bad days in a sense. And I would say people are very important to have and they will help you, but they can't be your hope because people are imperfect. And if or when they fail you, you feel hopeless. And so your hope has to be in something that will not fail you, period. And so as a Christian, I put my faith, my hope in God. He is my hope. And so that that is good because God is perfect and he's not going to fail me. There are times where sometimes I go through rough patches and I misplace my hope and that lets me down. So make sure you know where you're putting your hope in and make sure you're putting it in a source that's not going to fail you. And also, I had this realization too. I kind of think of it as like a circle of energy. It might sound weird, but I think this is important to know for like when you're going through something, but also if you're helping someone get through something. Um, let's say this is relevant right now for like my dad dealing with his cancer. So my dad is going through cancer. He's at the center of the circle. And so basically he can say or do whatever he wants. Like he's the one that's personally going through that experience. And so so he can say whatever he wants outward, but you have to only give energy to him inward. You can only give him positivity inward. You can't detract, you can't give negativity inward. Outside that circle is the next closest person that's affected by a situation. So in my opinion, that's my mom. And so my mom can only give positivity inward to my dad, but also it's really, if you're a family member of someone who has cancer, it's also very hard to go through yourself. You're going to have your down days. So you can only give energy inward, but you can vent outward. So my mom can vent to me and my brother and vice versa. So my brother and I would be on the next ring in a sense where we would give energy inward to my mom and my dad. So we can't vent to them, we can't give them negativity or stuff like that, but we can vent outwards because no matter what, if you're dealing with this situation, it's going to affect you in some way and you're going to have to sometimes have an outlet. So I can use my friends as outlets, but I can't take away inward, if that makes sense. So I think that I think that's a good thing if you're helping someone through something. Because I remember when my dad was in the hospital and when my mom was in the hospital, I would get upset where I was updating my family members as much as I could with new information. I just remember like I would get information, I would try to process it myself, but then I would also try to be diligent in updating my family members. But my family members would always kind of come at me in a sense where like they were upset obviously by the news, but um, they would be upset basically and they were going through it, but they would kind of vent to me inward. And it's like, okay, well, like I'm their daughter, I'm going through this situation myself. Like, please just like try to build me up right now instead of like coming at me with like how this is really hard on you and you don't know what you're going to do if you lose them. Cause like I'm having the same thoughts myself. So I think that was something I also learned through that situation. And so my third point is, and I think this is important, I think that pain is never wasted. Um, I think that when you wrestle through a difficult circumstance, you might get a blessing, but that blessing might look like a wound. And so the blessing might look like being exposed to a place of vulnerability. And when you wrestle with your vulnerability, you find out who you are. For me, my thought process was, if I'm going to go through this whole situation, um, you know, with my dad being in the hospital, now out of the hospital, like now dealing with cancer, now dealing with, X, Y, and Z, like all these, things that seem like hardships and misfortunes. If I'm going to go through all these things, I'm going to make sure that I'm going to grow through all these things. I'm going to make sure that this pain is not wasted, that I'm going to become a better person because of it. And it's hard, I look back at this experience, and it's still difficult to this day, but at the same time, there are a lot of blessings that are coming out of it. Our whole family dynamic has changed. Um, we, not that like we're a family that fights, but sometimes as a family you can fight over little stupid things, and we don't fight anymore. Like I don't fight with my dad, and like our relationship is so much stronger because of everything that we just went through. And um and I make sure that, when I'm home, that I'm truly present, that I'm, even though I'm at school and I'm not with him, um when I'm home, I make sure I spend really quality time with him, and that we have meaningful conversations. Everything is intentional now. And so I remember that was one thing I struggled with a lot last semester. Part of the reason why I saw a counselor was because I felt this extreme sense of guilt that, like I felt like I did that to them. I brought COVID home, and they went through all that because of me. And I mean, part of that is true, but I felt super guilty about it, and I also felt guilty about how, if this is the last few years of my dad's life, I'm not there for it. Like I'm not present with him. I'm not there to take care of him. All these, you start to think about everything that you're missing. And I realized, like, okay, well, instead of looking at everything I'm missing, how can I make the most out of the opportunities I'm going to be given with him? And so a blessing is that our entire family dynamic has changed for the better. And also for me, like being exposed to a vulnerable place was very beneficial. I think that student athletes, or I think athletes in general, um, were told, like it's somehow ingrained in us that we can't be vulnerable, that we have to move on, that when affliction happens, like we have to just get through it. And I remember, like, with everything I was going through for the past, like not even like this year of COVID, but just like things before, I remember like I felt like I just have to get through it. I just have to get through it. Like just try to be at your best 24/7. And that's just not possible. And so I finally was able to deal with all this kept up anxiety that I had. And I was able to finally work through my thoughts, and have a have much better mental health because of it. I would say one of my biggest takeaways that I had, one of my biggest breakthroughs I had with mental health was, you can't always control the thoughts that you have, but you can control how much weight you give your thoughts. And so that was one thing that, even though I was dealing with all this guilt and all this anxiety over what was happening, um, I couldn't control sometimes when I would get those thoughts of guilt and stuff, but I could control how much weight I gave it, and try to rewrite the story of those thoughts, and try to bring good out of getting those thoughts. Um, and so one thing that I want to close with is that um, I think the overall biggest takeaway is that I'm actually pulling it from one of my favorite authors is Bob Goff. And so he has this quote, and it's, "Hope doesn't go to sleep just because it's dark outside. It lights a candle and stays up waiting for the rest of the story." And I love that quote, but I want to amend it in one way. You can't be content with sleeping through the night and waking up unchanged. And life unpredictable, things are going to happen, things are going to hurt, you're going to go through pain, but you can bring good out of that pain. So make sure that when you go through hard things, you don't miss the miracle in it. So I would say that's my biggest takeaway out of everything, is that, you know, you're given people to help you get through stuff. Make sure you have hope that won't fail you, and then also pain is never wasted. So you're going to go through hard things, but make sure that you don't miss the miracle in going through those hard things. So that's about it. That's all I have. I hope that today it was insightful.